chime in at any time and help me out.
Well, I've got the book, I bought the book and I've read it. My great-granduncle was a colonel of the 10th Arkansas Regiment, and he had several of his men that were members of the Immortal 600. And in the book, I've got it highlighted in the back, where they list all of them.
Are you talking about this one?
Yes.
Okay. Because there was also another one that was written in 1905.
Okay.
Which
Yeah,
we'll
I
get
don't
to.
have that one, I just have this one.
Well, this is great. It's great research on that. But we're going to start with Stanton and Grant. Can all of y'all see this?
Yes.
Of August
If
1864.
you could speak up a little bit, this room's acoustics don't work real well. So any additional volume, and we don't have a microphone, unfortunately.
Get right in the middle of us and have at it.
By August 1864, Confederate prisoners far outnumbered Union prisoners, adding the fear that the cartel would release thousands more Confederate. Grant felt that once released, Confederate prisoners would likely violate their parole and rejoin their unit, whereas many of the Union prisoners, not so much. They'd only go home. General Grant is contributed to saying, "Every man we hold, when released on parole or otherwise, becomes an active soldier against us at once, either directly or indirectly. If we commerce a system of exchange which liberates all prisoners taken, we will have to fight until the whole South is eliminated." He was afraid of us. Next. And of course, we've all heard of Andersonville. The prison was created in February 1864 and served until April 1865. The 26.5 acre site was designed for a maximum of 10,000 men. At its most crowded, it held more than 32,000. Many of them wounded, starving, living in horrific conditions with rampant disease, contaminated water, and only minimal shelter from the elements. In the prison's 14 months of existence, some 45,000 Union prisoners arrived there. Of those, 12,920 died and are buried in the prison cemetery. And Edward DeMont, is that the way you pronounce it? Stated he was an Andersonville prisoner, and he stated that the 12,000 that died were due to the federal government's participation. The Confederate government requested prison exchange on humanitarian grounds many times, but the North turned a deaf ear to the pleas. The federal deaths in Southern prisons were under 9%, while the Confederate deaths in Northern prisons were over 12%. As an independent reporter, Botte became a critic of President Lincoln and his handling of prisons and prisoners' welfare during the war. And so now it starts. First, General Foster insisted on 50 Confederate veterans, officers, to be put in Charleston, where the Union was firing shells in June 24, 1864. The Confederates moved their Union prisoners to Columbus, South Carolina because of a yellow fever epidemic. The Union response to that was increased shelling without removing the federal prisoners. Finally, the 50 Confederate prisoners were exchanged on August the 3rd. And a side note, General Foster served in the U.S. Army for the rest of the time after the war and is credited with developing underwater demolition techniques. He died in New Hampshire in 1874 and received a hero's funeral from the people of the Granite State. So Foster lost his 50, and then he heard of Andersonville, and he says, aha, a new reason. So then he asked for 600 veterans. And as you see, he couldn't just ask for them and get them. Was a requisition. It had to go higher up, all the way to Stanton. Now the 600 were chose from the Fort Delaware. Fort Delaware was built in 1859 for defense on the Delaware River, protecting the ports of Wilmington and Philadelphia. It was the largest fort in the U.S. at the time. When the war came, Fort Delaware became a prison camp for Confederate captives. Fort Delaware was commanded by General Scott and Captain George All, adjutant to the general, and was directly responsible for all that occurred inside the prison. The thousands of captives from Gettysburg added 16,000 prisoners now being kept on a 6-acre complex. No other northern prison was as dreaded by the South. By 1863, Fort Delaware had gained a reputation among the Confederate soldiers as a place of cruelty. Its inmates called it the Fort Delaware Death Pen. Horrific conditions led to an astonishing amount of deaths at Fort Delaware, and the deceased were buried at Fort Mont in New Jersey. Okay, the 600 were chosen, and they were put on an old cargo freighter that was outfitted for the prison transport. 2 gunboats remained alongside the ship as the escort, and the steamer Admiral brought up the rear of the convoy. On August 21st, en route to Hilton Head, Grant notified Foster that he was not to exchange prisoners for any reason. And you see the one escape, Captain Ellison, swam 11 miles in shark-infested waters and went back to his unit. Another escape happened when the ship was unloaded of prisoners. An old colored woman, a stewardess on the ship, recognized Colonel George William Woolfolk, Kentucky Cavalry, because he was her young master earlier in their lives. She hid him in her room until the ship returned to New York. She smuggled him ashore and gave him money to travel on. He headed to Canada, then to England, and then back to the South to his unit. And now they're on the Crescent ship. They're under Captain Prentice. As you see in the 3rd paragraph, they were only allowed to go to the water closet, which was on top of the ship, one at a time. There were 600 down in the belly of the ship. And they had to go up the stairs, across the deck, and to the water closet. Now we're traveling from Delaware down to South Carolina. There's some seasickness, but they can't go to the water closet, so they spill it right there where they are. That means the belly of the ship becomes pretty smelly. Captain Dunkel of the 25th Virginia wrote in his journal, "No pen can convey to the mind an area of cruel agony of suffering without water, shut out from light and fresh air in the heat of summer, and combined with a heated steam boiler." Now, Captain Prentice was Mr. Jekyll, Dr. Hyde. He was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. He was cruel to the soldiers, but when he got home after the war, he served as a member of the school board at Fort Bentwood, West Virginia, and Steubenville, Ohio. He was one of Steubenville's best citizens, and he and his wife were highly respected. Finally, when they got to Port Royal, Lieutenant Colonel Carmichael had the ship cleaned. 40 of the most severely wounded was transferred to the Federal Military Hospital, bringing the amount down to 560. Now, they started in August of the 20th and finally arrived at Charleston Harbor September 1st. But they had to sit on the boat another week. Captain Walter McRae, 7th North Carolina Infantry, stated, "When we finally came out into the light of day from the hold of the ship and had a look at each other, we were astonished to note the ravages made by the terrible heat and the nauseous confinement. One could scarcely recognize his best friends." Now they're out of the ship and they're on the Morris Island. The continuing bombardment affected the availability of sleep for the prisoners. Some shells burst over the camp. No men were harmed by the shelling, but they suffered from the agony of anticipating death at every moment. The rumors came fact, even though the thought that no civilized nation would condone such treatment. "We were emphatically acting as breastworks for the enemy," wrote Captain Dickerson, 2nd Virginia. Captain Pinckney, 4th South Carolina South Cavalry, wrote, "He failed to see how being used in this manner was going to help the federal government." But no, wait.
Not so quick there, little boy.
Clicky fingers.
Okay, now the men are under Captain Hallowell. And you can see in the 2nd chapter, Colonel Shaw of the 54th Massachusetts, which we all know from the movie Glory, described Captain Hallowell as an abolitionist with an obsessive hatred for the South. Captain John Murray, 11th Virginia Cavalry, described Colonel Hallowell as about the meanest fellow our misfortunes brought us to connect with. He treated us like animals. There was nothing this fellow left undone to make us uncomfortable and annoy us. He never let one opportunity pass to show his hatred for the South and her soldiers. The tents were set up in a row. The Negro sergeant had charge of each row, calling it his company. These sergeants were generally kind to us, expressing their sorrow that we had so little to eat. We had a point in common with them: intense hatred for their colonel. Their hatred of him was equal only to their fear of him. His treatment of them, for the least violation of orders, was barbaric. He would ride at them, knock and beat them over the head with his saber, and draw his pistol and shoot at them. Okay. And you see the 2nd paragraph. Not only were they having the cannons go across over their heads, but they had a gun sitting there staring at them. So they were definitely in fear of their lives the whole time. Their breakfast was 4 moldy crackers and 1 ounce of meat, and dinner was 1/2 pint of bean soup. No supper. Lieutenant Glaser, 26th New York Cavalry, reported, "The prisoners constantly wear a forlorn and haggard look, owing in a great measure to starvation and exposure to danger. Constantly under fire by day and night, many have become hopelessly insane, while others have been incapacitated for all the duties of life hereafter. Nothing but strong nerves and an inflexible will can save one under such circumstances." Okay, Washington says, "Okay, you've had your fun. There's no reason to keep them. Let's get rid of them." General Foster's not ready to lose control, so he just moves them. He moves half to Fort Pulaski and half to Hilton Head. From December to February, they were fed about 10 ounces of rotten cornmeal and a pickle diet. Charles Busby, 5th North Carolina Regiment, stated in December 27, 1864, "Our rations were very meager. After I left Fort Pulaski, I understood that the prisoners who remained ate all the animals in the fort, cats, dogs, rats, anything they could find, of which there was quite a number, stewing them on the stove in tin cans. It was particularly exasperating to be encased within a dungeon-like hole and gaze while almost starving through the gated casement windows at oysters in abundance clinging to the side of the moat. Many men quickly grew in the damp grew ill in the damp, freezing casements of Fort Pulaski, suffering from bronchitis, dysentery, pneumonia, and scurvy. Seeing so much suffering around them, the compassionate Confederate officers formed a relief association, the stronger, healthier men helping those who were weaker and sick. Now, whereas in Andersonville, the Union soldiers formed a gang and preyed on the weak and sick. The difference. Colonel Brown helped get 25 sick prisoners changed, plus 6 others. And the 6 extras wrote a thank you note that was placed in the local newspaper. Colonel Brown didn't see it, but General Foster did. General's command wrote Colonel Brown that he had been notified of the correct treatment of the prisoners repeatedly, and they were not to be exchanged or given full rations. The General Orders number 11, Colonel Brown was ordered to cut the rations to 1/4 pound of meal per day. And again, Botte, who was in Andersonville, is blaming the federal government. He arrived in the United States from Ireland in 1861 with his wife and 2 children and became a freelance journalist. Edward Botte enlisted in Company K, 42nd New York Regiment under the alias of Edward Bates. He was taken prisoner following the Battle of Bristow Station and first imprisoned at Belle Island before being sent to Camp Sumter, Andersonville, Georgia. He became a vicious critic of President Lincoln and the handling of prisons and prisoners' welfare during the war. People argued that the appalling conditions were a direct result of the Union blockade of southern ports, and that the guards in camps like Andersonville were little better off than the prisoners. Edward Botte fell firmly into that camp and argued strongly after the war that conditions in Andersonville were a direct consequence of the actions of his own federal government. After his release, Botte published an article in the New York Times that was a damning indictment of the government of President Abraham Lincoln. He wrote the true story of Andersonville, told by a federal prisoner, that was produced in the New York News and Southern Historical Society papers. And he testified for General Worth at his trial. That's a lot of words, but basically the Confederates were begging the Union to take their men back, that we can't feed them, take them. Kate Cummings, who was a lady in Mobile, grew up in Mobile, and volunteered as a nurse after Battle of Shiloh, wrote in her journal in December 1863, Lincoln has again refused to exchange prisoners. I do think this is the cruelest act of which he has been guilty, not only to us, but his own men. He is fully aware that we can scarcely get enough of the necessities of life to feed our own men, and how can he expect us to feed his? Colonel Ode offered to purchase medicine in the North for the federal prisoners, paying therefore in gold, cotton, or tobacco, but this offer was not accepted. In his book, The War Between the States, Mr. Alexander Stevens says, had Davis' repeated offers been accepted, no prisoner on either side would have been retained in a confinement a day. President Davis stated, the real cause of all the protracted suffering of prisoners, North and South, is directly due to the humane refusal of the federal government to exchange prisoners of war. And the question is, are these people monsters? My answer is yes. Okay. On that third paragraph, What civilized country would do that? The Lane Resolution of 98 of the 38th Congress was proposed by Indiana Senator Henry Smith Lane. He wanted retaliation and retribution, not exchange. Lane wanted vengeance to the South, saying on the floor of Congress, "I would make the wars still bloodier. I would make every rocky ravine in southern Georgia and Alabama run red with the blood of traitors, and I would drive to the Gulf Stream, the last rebel there, before I would recognize their independence." The more moderate senators preferred to reinstate the policy of exchange, not implement government-sanctioned murder. Senator Hendricks suggested an investigation of the Secretary of War on the grounds that it had been proven Stanton was directly involved in the curtailment of the exchange. The land of the Goth. Now we're to there were 26 Alabamians that were in the Immortal 600. We have Lieutenant Richard Adams. He was a staff officer for General Wheeler. He's buried in Radford, Virginia. Adams wrote, I will never forget the trip on board the steamer Chestnut, where the 600 men were packed into a hold of a vessel, a la Sardine. William Allen is in Guntersville. There's a ton of Allens, and I haven't found him, but I know he's buried in Guntersville. James Andrews grew up on the forks of Cypress and Plantation. He's buried in Grenada, Mississippi. This guy right here is Andrews. This was taken at Fort Delaware before he was shipped out. The next one. Lieutenant Andrew Armstrong, as you can see, he said, I will never go hungry again. And the ones that I found after the war, they all served their community. They never shied from service. Lieutenant Washington Bass, and Armstrong is buried in Henry County, Alabama. Bass is buried in Bates County, Missouri. This is a character, Lieutenant Bates. We have two Northerners that joined the Alabama. He was born in Springfield, Massachusetts, born and raised there. He was engineer, had his degree in engineering, and working for the federal government. And he was down in Selma when the war started. He joined the South, and he continued to live. He was buried in Perry County, Alabama, so he came back after the war to the South. He was one of the oldest. He was the oldest of all the Immortal 600. He wrote, packed on board of the small Gulf Stream ship, Crescent City, like cattle, are packed in rail cars. The men were even together for 18 days, suffering the torture of the damned. Lieutenant Bedell is buried in Texas. Lieutenant Bishop, the poor guy who was born and raised in Alabama, his whole family, and yet he came from a divided family. His brothers and cousins fought for the Union. He's buried in Marion County, Alabama. Lieutenant Bond, the man was gut shot and survived. He's buried in Tuskegee. We had 3 that were from Tuskegee. Lieutenant Breedlove is the second one buried in Tuskegee. Lieutenant Burton is buried in Scotts, Alabama. Captain Richard Campbell is buried in Blount County, Alabama. This is the second Northerner. He was born and raised in Maine and didn't move down to Alabama until 1860. He stayed and fought. He's buried in Jefferson County, Alabama. Captain Chambers, I don't know where he's at. And poor Captain Chisholm, he made it all the way through until March, and he died before they were released in June. He was only, I think he was 29 years old when he died. Captain Chitwood is buried in Atlanta, Georgia. Here's another one. Once he came back, he served his community. He was a county commissioner. He's buried in Birmingham, Alabama. Sergeant Ellison was the one that swam the 11 miles in the shark-infested waters. He was, before the war, he was earning a living as a bricklayer. In April 1861, he volunteered with the Washington Light Guards, which shortly after became Company E of the 3rd Alabama. The 3rd Alabama was the first regiment to reach Virginia from any Confederate state. And it says, if you'll notice there, he captured 40 prisoners by himself. And they asked him how he did it, and he said, I surrounded them and I captured them. That's a forest trip.
Sergeant York treatment.
He was introduced to Robert E. Lee as the best man in the Corps. Captain Fanning. Ellison's buried in Texas. Fanning is our 3rd Tuskegee guy. And this was in the Confederate Veteran magazine. There are so many articles about him written by men who served with him. He was well loved and respected. He's from Texas. His father, Reverend Edward Fontaine, wrote to the Confederate Secretary of War in 1862, I have had my oldest son, Lamar, educated from childhood in the profession of arms. He had the promise of an appointment at West Point at the time of disruption of the federal government. I attended him for the Corps of Engineers. I directed his early studies with a reference to that objective, but his life in Texas and experience qualified him better for the cavalry services. He draws, paints well, good mathematician, knows Latin, Greek, and French, and understands Spanish, which he speaks well. As a horseman, swordsman, and a marksman, with a rifle and pistol, he has but few superiors. He has read carefully an extensive course in ancient and modern history and is well informed in general literature. He was a cadet at the Bastogne Military Academy when the Revolution commenced. He joined the first volunteer company raised in this county after the state seceded. Lamar wrote in the Confederate Veteran magazine, I think the privatization that we survived while under Negro guards and the fire of our own guns for 42 days in the harbor of Charleston entitles us to special notice, as the awful horror of that hell on earth still remains with each of us as long as reason sits enthroned. These guys, I mean, this is another, you'll notice he was wounded numerous times. He was left on the battlefield at Gettysburg because he had so many wounds. And yet he never quit. He was one of the first of the 50 that was taken by General Foster. And so he was changed on August the 3rd, and on crutches went back to report to duty. He was a lawyer before the war, and he was in politics before and after.
He went to Alabama, Roll Tide.
A whole time. Yeah. Lieutenant Foster, he was changed at Hilton Head. I don't have anything on him. John Haynes is buried in Texas. I like it on the index cards when it gives the complexion, eyes blue, height 5'9". Found that in several of them. Alexander Kirkman was another interesting character. He was in Heidelberg University in Germany when the war started, and he made his way back to the South to fight. He's buried in Boulevard, Tennessee. Lieutenant Ledyard is changed early. Is changed January the 5th, 1865. But he had the yellow fever and died at the age of 32. He's buried in Mobile, Alabama. And here's our local one. Colonel Maston, born and raised in Huntsville. A card-playing gentleman, evidently was the first Lieutenant Edmund Maston, a cadet at LaGrange College when the war began. Young Maston was first assigned as drill master, however he soon commissioned as adjutant of the 8th Arkansas Infantry Regiment. Maston was captured at Charleston, Tennessee on December 28, 1863, while serving as the adjutant general of the 4th Division Cavalry under Joseph Wheeler. And again, once he got out, he continued to serve his community. He was the mayor of Huntsville for 3 terms, and he's buried in Maple Hill Cemetery. He's close enough for us to honor him.
You guys think Maston Road in Huntsville is named after him?
Yeah, since he was mayor of that.
Yeah, they'll change it. They'll change it.
Yeah. Better keep it quiet.
Captain Meadows, he was a prison hopper. He was in Johnson Island, Camp Chase, Fort Columbus, Johnson Island, Point Lookout, Fort Delaware, and he's buried in Tallapoosa County.
I'm kin to him.
Are you?
I am kin to him. That is my great. He was a cousin by marriage. But
wonderful.
I have been to his grave, and they had the SCV of Tallahassee had a marker placed, and I was able to go to that dedication, and that's probably 10 years ago.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, that's awesome.
He should be remembered. Captain Dunkel, 25th Virginia Cavalry Infantry, wrote in 1869 on returning back to Fort Delaware. We exhibited the appearance of having been treated with extreme cruelty and excessive horror. Our comrades scarcely knew us. So changed were our features, so haggard were our countenance. Our number 2 was changed from what had been, for we now only numbered half of what we had at first. Many of us had diseases from which we never recovered. Some died in a short time, some lived longer, and some lingered invalids still. Captain Park of the 12th Alabama Infantry, who was at Fort Delaware and wasn't chosen, said in August 600 were sent and subjected to the harshest treatment, exposed in the sickly malarial season to the severest hardships. For 43 days they lived in 10 ounces of meal and 4 ounces of pickles per day. not a vegetable or a pound of meat was issued to them, and consequently, that depressing and dreaded disease scurvy became general among them. All this was caused by their rigid confinement and want of nourishing food. Our hard fare and rough treatment at Fort Delaware hath been princely, compared with what was inflicted upon the scurvy-afflicted Fort Pulaski sufferers. Captain John Murray of the 11th Virginia Cavalry published a book in 1905 about his experience during being one of the Immortal 600. He's the one that he wrote the book 40 years later, but you can read the pain through the whole book. It's never left him. It's well worth reading if you can ever find it. Survivors finally were transferred to Virginia. Somewhere it's changed, but nearly 300 returned to Fort Delaware to wait till they were healthier. Some historians believe the Federals didn't want to be embarrassed by the Confederate officers' condition because they had complained about the treatment of Union prisoners at Andersonville. Now, we've all seen pictures of the Union soldiers from Andersonville, but there's no pictures of the Immortal 600 after their experience. John Murray introduced the bill to the U.S. Senate, citing their treatment as a violation of international prisoner of war rules. At the hearing, however, the committee seemed unwilling to believe that 600 were ever placed under fire by order of Secretary of War Stanton, even though there was no doubt that Stanton knew of the plan. The U.S. Congress was aware of Foster's actions during the debate on the retaliation policy. The bill was killed in committee. Congress has not changed. And here's a breakdown of how most of them came out. And as you can see, only 295 could stand at the end. Captain Dunkel, 25th Virginia Infantry, wrote, "Those days of anguish are too detestable to be forced upon the memory, and I shudder when called upon to narrate the facts. They often haunt me in the dreams and make vivid to my mind the shrieks of pain, the groan of misery, the cries of despair, and the wailing of agony of the 600. You can imagine the PTSD that he's going, those men went through. The 600 had heart. Their story has many positive attributes about which we need to be reminded in the 21st century. That is, unselfishness, faith, loyalty, principled behavior, compassionate for our fellow man. This was their contribution to the legacy that was the Confederate soldier. And that's why we're proud to be Confederate ancestors. That's it. Is there any questions that I can't answer?
Well, Margaret.